Between the Covers is brought to you in part through the support of Propeller, a magazine of books, music, art, film, and life, and its publishing imprint, Propeller Books. Visit them on the web at propellermag.com and propellerbooks.com or on Twitter at propellermag. Before we begin today's program, I wanted to talk briefly about a past guest, Jesse Ball, and an offer he has made to listeners on behalf of the program. I suspect many of you know who Jesse Ball is, since he was recently a guest on Between the Covers, and yet is already the second most listened to episode of all time. If you don't know him, you should definitely check out our conversation and explore his work. Jesse Ball sent me copies of his 2006 book that he co-wrote with the Icelandic poet and novelist Þórdís Björnsdóttir, called Vera and Linus, to offer as gifts for people who support the Between the Covers Patreon campaign. Vera and Linus is a gorgeous object, full of illustrations, and made with care by an Icelandic small press. The story is composed of a mixture of what could be called prose poetry, flash fiction, and sketches, and Publishers Weekly says of Vera and Linus, the light touch and often archaic feel of the prose owes as much to Kafka as to classic fairy tales. Certainly, many readers will find this book unsettling, but most will also find it hard not to remember a time when the world was filled with this kind of fearful mystery and wonder. Vera and Linus is out of print. The Icelandic publisher no longer exists, so this is a rare memento. For people who are not already supporters of the program, if you begin ongoing support of the show at $2 an episode through Patreon, that is patreon.com, patreon.com/betweenthecovers, you can receive a copy of Vera and Linus. If you're already a supporter either via PayPal or Patreon, you likewise can get a copy by increasing your support by $1 an episode, or if you're a PayPal supporter, beginning a Patreon support at $1 an episode. Again, this is at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. Enjoy today's program. Good morning and welcome to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's guest is writer Peter Rock. Rock is the author of 9 books. These include the story collection The Unsettling, which was selected and introduced by Brian Evanson for a Pharos edition publication, a collection Daniel Handler calls perhaps the best short story collection he has ever read. Rock is also the author of the book My Abandonment, of which Ursula K. Le Guin says, Peter Rock shows he is a master at making strange behavior and strange situations utterly believable and filling them with unbearable suspense. Rick Bass calls his book The Shelter Cycle as luminous as it is sinister and innocent. And Joanne Beard says his young adult novel Klickitat is eerily wonderful, remarkable, and disturbing, just like childhood. Peter Rock is a graduate of Yale University and teaches writing here in Portland, Oregon in the English department of Reed College. He's a recipient of a Wallace Stegner Fellowship at Stanford University, a National Endowment of the Arts Fellowship, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, which he used to bring his latest multidisciplinary project, the one he's here to talk about today, into being. This latest book from Counterpoint Press is called Spells, a novel within photographs. Before Spells was a book, it was an art installation, a coupling not only of narrative and photography, but also of sound and video. Spells the book does not use photographs merely to illustrate the story Peter Rock wrote, but instead the photographs came first. In other words, the photographs were used to generate the story. Oregon Book Award winner Cari Luna says of Spells, "The result is a novel unlike any I've read before, that weaves elements of realism, fable, prose poetry, and essay through the supporting structure of images to create something beautiful and unsettling." Welcome to Between the Covers, Peter Rock.
Oh, thank you. It's delightful to be here.
So in the introduction to Spells, you discuss the origin story of the project, which is two-pronged. The first prong, a job you had in an art museum 20 years ago, and the second, a more recent conversation you had with a photographer, a person who posed some difficult artistic and metaphysical questions to you. So maybe we can start with you fleshing out these two parts of the origin story of how Spells became this unusual project.
Okay. Yeah, there are a couple different stories. There are a few, and I guess I'll take those backward. I was, I guess, just procrastinating, and I think one of the things I've learned in all this time writing is that all people who want to write procrastinate, and part of the trick is figuring out how to make that procrastination productive. So one way I procrastinate is to look for photographs for covers of books when they're almost done. And when I was working on the shelter cycle, I was almost done with it. And I was looking at pictures of raccoons because it had a different title initially. And I contacted a photographer and I said, this is what's going to happen. I'm going to, if you let me, show this photograph to the publisher as the kind of thing I think would work on the cover. And they're going to humor me for about 6 months. And then at the last minute, they'll tell me they can't use it and they've changed it and it's too late to talk about it. And he said, that's great, that's fine. And this is a photographer I didn't know named Peter McCullough, who was down in the Bay Area. And he wrote back to me a while later and said, listen, I'll trade you a print of that photograph for a book if you want. And I said, that's a terrible trade for you, so I'll take it. And he sent me not only a print of the photograph of the raccoon, but a couple other photographs and then a whole bunch of snapshots he thought I might be interested in for some reason. And this letter, which was the longest letter that I'd received since, I guess, the high school girlfriends of Salt Lake City of the 80s. It was, I think some of it was handwritten, some of it was typed, and it was full of these questions, which were huge questions, like, when did you know this is what you were supposed to do? When can you recognize that something has gone wrong in your work, and how have you reacted to this in the past? And then it was mixed in with these other questions, which were sort of like, how did you know your wife was the woman for you forever? And, can you build a house with your hands? Would you like to? And it was coming at an interesting moment for me, which is maybe shortly, I was finishing the shelter cycle, and my abandonment, which was then and is now and probably will continue to be the most successful of my books. It was the first time ever that people were curious about what I was going to do, or where there were expectations for what I should do. And so I thought it was probably a good time to do something that no one wanted me to do, or to work on some private projects. And I was trying to figure out what was going on with me at that moment, or what I should do next. And I was thinking hard about it. And these questions seemed to be questions I should try to answer. So I set aside about 20 minutes a day, which was all I had, to write an answer to this letter. And I was really writing to myself because I didn't know him. And amid that letter, I told the story of how I worked as a security guard in an art museum in upstate New York. And it was a job that was blindingly boring in many ways, and it was a job that many people quit. And it was a museum, it's a beautiful museum, but it was often empty. And when people were in it, we weren't allowed to talk to them, and we weren't allowed to write anything. It was before phones, which really would change that job. So what I would do is I would just try to stare into the paintings or into the sculptures or the artwork, and I'd try to make up stories, and I'd try to hold as much as I could in my mind. And it was a building that had 6 floors, and there were 7 guards, I think, at a time. So there'd be one person on every floor, and one person would be on break. And so every half hour, whoever was on break went to the top floor, and everyone went down a floor. And I would furtively, with a stub of pencil on the fire stairs, write down as many ideas as I could before I arrived at the next floor. And then when I got down to the bottom on my break, I would just write everything I could, and then I would start again. And at the end of the day, I had all of these things to write about. And when I wrote this down to Peter McCullough, I thought that's exactly the kind of thing I should be doing. That is, I want to be provoked. I want to write something that I haven't written before, and I want to collaborate in a way that I haven't before too. So that's kind of a long version, but those were some of the first origin stories of how it came to be.
Yeah, and when you decided you wanted to sort of capture that imaginative process from when you were in the art museum and create a book that was a collaboration with photographers.
Right.
It's because people who can't see the book, the color photography in the book is as prominent as the text, and you can feel that there's a partnership happening between you and the people you chose to collaborate with. How did that happen? So how did you go from this strange letter writing with one photographer to picking photographers and then individual photographs to then start as your template to imagine stories?
It was, I mean, in retrospect, it's like anything, it's kind of easy to be really clear and to see that, you know, you knew what you were doing, when part of the strategy for this project all along was that I didn't know what I was doing, and I didn't know that it would be a book, and we could talk about that later. I just wanted to write some things that would be surprising to me, and it was something that I didn't necessarily believe was going to be for other people's consumption. I was just in my basement working on it, and I didn't know that the pieces would be connected at all. I didn't know what would become of it, but I did have a number of photographers I was interested in, and I had a list. And the first thing I did was I asked Peter McCullough. I said, "Would you be interested in doing this?" And he said, "Sure." And then I asked his opinion about photographers, and he made a list. And I kind of just wrote to the first 5 people. I decided 5 was a good number, and said basically, "I want to work with your photographs. Is that okay? I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know. We can talk about it later if it becomes something, but I just don't know. If you'd send me 25 or 30 images, that'd be great." I mean, the first thing was the first 5 people were really happy to hear from me and really eager to collaborate. And that was maybe the main, greatest thing about the project, was just how cool people are and how generous they were and how down they were for whatever thing it was that I wanted to do. And so, that said, some of them sent me 25 or 30 images, and some of them sent me more like 100. And that made it very difficult to choose, because I thought maybe I'll choose 5 a piece and that would work. But then I realized that if I really didn't want to know where I was going or what I was doing, there'd be no way for me to choose. So I just chose one photograph from each of the photographers, and I started there. And then that's sort of how I proceeded. I just chose 5 at a time. And then I would try to work on those 5 stories at a time. And once I got about 13 or 14 in, I saw that a lot of things were becoming connected, or characters were continuous, and that created different pressures in terms of what I would choose. So if you look at the book, it's not completely a coincidence, but it is sort of strange to me that so many of the photographs that I was given from different photographers contained, so many bears, so many dogs, so many decapitated heads, by the frame. So as these became questions in the book, how to account for the fact that there are all these bodies without heads, there are all these heads without bodies, how to account for the fact that if characters are continuous and I don't have pictures of the same people over and over again, how do you account for why someone looks so different in a story than they did before? So those transformations also sort of drove the plot.
But I was curious about if you had other constraints in the process of writing. For instance, as you mentioned, when you realized that it started becoming a book that was continuous, and you had that tension around preserving a narrative cohesion while also having sort of discrete, somewhat standalone pieces and photographs that aren't in real life connected to each other. When you had that constraint, were you looking at all of the unselected photographs? Did you allow yourself to look at all of the as of yet unselected photographs and move them around, or were you ever writing between 2 photographs that you hadn't yet selected, or was it always one photograph? I don't know if these questions are making sense, but I was curious how much freedom you were allowed with the things that hadn't yet been established into the book in figuring out your next step.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways to answer that question, because initially I made color copies of all the photographs and I just hung them all around the room where I work. Okay. And so I had them everywhere, and I was sort of wallpapering my room and changing the atmosphere in that way. And so I started to, as I was traveling through the book be aware of possibilities, and a lot of times I was sort of between, and I was writing 5 things at a time typically, so I was moving back and forth, and then some things changed as I got deeper into the project. So I think there's a story called The Daughter and the Dog, which is the first image is an image by Colleen Plum, which is an image of, it looks to be a man digging a grave, and it is a man digging a grave for a dog. And I started to write that story, and I got so stuck. I was so into the image, and I was so into what I had written, but I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen. And I was looking around the room, and I saw another photograph by Sarah LaFleur Vetter, which is a photograph of a naked girl and a dog playing in a yard, I guess. And it was the first time I thought, and this seems like, and in a way, when you think of all of the kind of text and image-based things and video, this project is so lame and lo-fi, and I constrained myself in so many ways. But that, like, weirdly was the first time I thought, well, wait a minute, what if I had 2 photographs in a story? And so that, there are, I think, 31 stories and 43 images, but it was pretty late in the game that I realized I'm going to try mixing this up a little bit more, adding photographs in, and it did help me to find a different dimension. I would say also that pretty late, too, once I had about, 30 stories, I kind of could see what I thought a plot might be like and how it might be coherent. And that was the only time when I asked the photographers for specific images that I didn't have, that I knew existed. And they gave them to me, and I wrote another 15 stories or so. And I thought, this is like, if I write more, I can make this coherent, I can make it work. And after a few months, I realized I didn't need more stories, I just needed less. I needed it to be more fragmentary, and I needed to stop imposing my will in quite that way. So that was a good thing to learn too. So some of those stories I like a lot, but they didn't seem like they were part of it. I guess the last thing I would say, there's a million constraints, but one is that so much of my work is my other books bleed into each other and characters recur. I wanted this to be completely separate. I just wanted to stop as sort of my first, maybe middle-aged book where I was like, okay, I'm leaving all that behind. I'm writing something that is completely different and new.
With this tension between you're wanting to preserve some semblance of narrative, but also have this sort of fragmentary discontinuity, do you feel like the dreamlike quality of this book and sort of the loosening of what we would consider an expected cause and effect that isn't in this book, and this bleeding between living and the dead, awake and asleep, do you feel like that's a product of this collaboration that arose from it, or is it something that you came to the project with?
I think it's both. Of course, it's sort of I was very much aware in this in teaching, but also in people's reaction to my work, that when there is something we've been talking a lot about in my classes lately, like what is a dream and how do you deal with it in writing? Because of course, when you're dreaming, most of the time you don't realize you're dreaming, and that's the pleasure of it. And it's the same, like, why do we remember things? Why do we write about a memory? We want to feel the way that we did then. We want to forget where we are for a period of time. But whenever I've written something that has a fantastic element to it, or where it finds a register that seems as if it's beyond reality, oftentimes the reaction is, well, but what's really happening? Or, where is the dreamer? When is someone going to wake up? Or what is reality in this situation? And that seems like, to me, not that interesting a question. And I see these things as so continuous. So one thing that I wanted to play with in the book was, trying to subvert some of these traditional ways of understanding things, and to play around a little bit with cause and effect, or to, allow a fair number of resurrections, allow heads to continue to talk, to allow, what is even a person and what is an animal to be interchangeable in some ways. And so, I mean, and part of this can seem so conceptual and so uptight, but really one of the main instigating factors of this book is I just wanted to have fun. I wanted to write things that were full of energy and that surprised me and that were significantly different, because I think one thing that we typically do when we write a book is try to find a consistency, whether that's a consistency of voice or a consistency of reality level or, various things. So I wanted to try to write something that took into account a lot of different ways of telling a story and tried to crash them into each other in various ways.
You've talked about all these constraints that are in the book, but you've also talked about the constraints of your life that produced the book, that you were a new parent, that you were working full-time, and that your wife was a full-time worker, and that you had to find a form to fit the constraint of your life. And I was curious if this theme of constraints, if you were interested in the playfulness that is it's like the Aleppo movement or other constraint-based writers, if those were people like Calvino or Perec or Cano, are those writers that speak to you, or was that not really something that you felt connected to? Because I think of them as both. There's a weirdness, there's a conceptual aspect,
right?
But there's also a super playfulness to what they're doing at the same time.
I think those are writers I admire, but I don't feel any kind of real comradeship with. I feel like those are writers who are smarter than I am and whose intellectualism is forefront a lot of the time. But I think that the idea of what they're doing and the idea of constraint, as I tell students, everyone has a certain amount of energy and a certain amount of talent. And when we start telling stories, our inclination is to try to be everywhere at once and to try to satisfy everything. But if we're going to find depth in a story, we have to find a limit. And that limit is often in structure, it's often in time, it's often in space, it's often in point of view. And I think to embrace a limit is to get as deep as you can go. And to recognize a limit also is part of it. And I don't really see there to be a really easy line between what I do when I'm writing and what I do when I'm living, and to recognize the limits of your life, which is mortality on the one hand, but also just day to day. I think it's easy as someone who wishes to write to always be putting that off and always be thinking I'm paying a bunch of dues right now at work, and I have to spend as much time as I can with my children whom I love, but eventually I'm going to have more time to write than I do right now. And that, especially if one talks about writing a lot, which I think is pretty dangerous, and if one is a teacher, it can really lead to a sense of feeling like a fraud. So trying to stay in touch with actually writing is tricky. So when I was working on the Shelter Cycle, which was a long process involving a lot of interviews and a lot of people, it became a document that was over 1,000 pages long, and I'd go into my study and I would look at this pile of paper and I had 20 minutes or so, and I would just kind of shake my head or weep a little. Then I'd go back upstairs. And so I wanted to conceive of something that, yes, I could work on something while I was teaching. If I had 10 minutes, I could think about it. I think trying to recognize how the pressures of our life are going to change, or, how, I used to, when I was growing up, I had this idea that being a writer was kind of a destiny or an identity that people had. And that might be true for some people, but I think it's the first thing that people should try to get over in a way. And I've just been trying to think harder about, how to be a person who likes to write. And I'm not exaggerating, who likes to write. I love to do it, and I want to work in conditions that I love. I don't want to suffer for the next 30 years, 40 years, or whatever. And even recently, in the last year, I've gotten a dog. And the dog totally slows me down. I'm used to riding my bike everywhere and trying to figure out, now I have less time suddenly, and I spend all this time with this animal. How can I spend these walks as a way to generate material, or how can slowing down and having to have conversations with strangers all the time inform possibilities of things I might do?
Well, maybe this is a good time for people to hear some of the prose. Let's start with To Begin is to Start. And if you want to, you can describe the photograph that comes with it or not. It's up to you.
Yeah, the photograph, and it's the first piece in the book, and it's not the first piece I wrote, of course. I kind of wanted a beginning that was a series of warnings or a series of invitations. And the photograph is a photograph by Peter McCullough, which shows the back of a man's head going into a tent. And there's a long zipper that has been unzipped, and he seems to be welcomed into this tent. But it's a pretty dark photograph. It's black and white. It's a little bit scary, too, I think. And so I was looking at this, and I was trying to think, what is going to come out of me based on this? And it's a very funny... it doesn't sound that funny, but it's a funny piece in that I think collaboration works in so many ways. And when I look at this piece, I can see that I'm using the words of John Cage and I'm using the words of Ralph Waldo Emerson, and that, everything is a kind of collaboration. I'm not a huge believer in inspiration as such. So I'm reacting to the photograph, but I'm also reacting to things that I was reading at the time. To begin is to start. An idea is not a thing you have. It cannot be possessed like that, like an envelope or a letter. A risk is a thing you take, and a decision is a thing you make. A decision is not so fragile, not so tenuous as a promise, though both are things you make, beginnings. Sometimes the invitation comes from another person or another animal, a bear or dog or ghost. Sometimes it comes from oneself. It does not matter if an invitation comes from without or arises from within. Be still, yet ready to strike, poised and taut. A snake has more than 200 teeth pointed backward to zip you up, to bite and hold you securely. Security is always a misapprehension. You can slip away, you can take a risk. Be decisive. Power ceases in the instant of repose, and the inside of you never stops, your heart circling your blood around and around right now, 2,000 gallons in your lifetime. Wind blows in and out of you across the deserts and mountains. It slams doors in the middle of the night, wakes you with a start.
We've been listening to writer Peter Rock read from his latest book, Spells, a novel within photographs. Well, you mentioned something about how there are words in here from, say, Emerson. And we don't discover this actually until we get to the acknowledgments and spells, that this isn't solely a collaboration between you and 5 photographers, but in a sense it's a collaboration with you and I'm presuming writers that you admire, as you've included words from folk tales, from John Cage, from Kawabata, from Chekhov, unattributed within the text itself, weaving other writers' words into your own words. And I'm curious about that project, if you could talk a little bit about what that means to you and what you feel like it's doing to the text of Spells.
I mean, I guess cynically you could say I'm trying to claim the words of writers who are better writers than I am as my own, and that is kind of true. I think it's honest in the sense that these are the things that are resonant with what I'm trying to do, or these are the things that are provoking me. I think that we do this kind of thing unconsciously all the time, and some of this is unconscious and some of it's conscious. It's hard to know exactly. It's certainly a kind of homage to writers who have been helpful to me in terms of limitation. Like my favorite book probably is Kawabata's Palm of the Hand stories, and there's definitely, in one story, Illuminations, it pretty much rips off the first part of his story, The Grasshopper and the Bell Cricket, which is a story that I just can't read without crying. It's so beautiful. And then it sort of ends similarly to Chekhov's story, Gusev, which is, one of my favorite endings of a story. So that kind of mashup is happening too. And I think part of it, and I have a book coming out in 2019, I guess, which involves a lot of more personal information and artifacts of my life, whether it's letters I wrote to people or conversations I had with people. And that makes me super uncomfortable. And I think that a lot of, usually when I write something that I'm proud of, there are parts of that process that I feel really deeply uncomfortable with. With this book, I was really writing it for myself, and I didn't know that it was going to be a book or that it was going to surface in a way like this, and that I would have to admit that I was using these things because, when we read a book, it's ours as much as it is the other person's, and the context in which we understand it. When I read Kawabata, I'm reading it as someone who was born in 1967 in Salt Lake City, not as someone from Japan who understands the context of that work in the same way. So I think as a really personal project, and I guess in some ways that's what I want to write, is a really personal project, and I kind of want to read people writing things for themselves too. So I couldn't see taking it out. Like this kind of thing, I wanted to be honest about it in the acknowledgments at least, but I also think interrupting what you're doing to say, and by the way, these aren't all my words, is sort of also too much of an interruption.
What's interesting about it too is when you were talking earlier about not feeling anymore like being a writer is this like special calling, and maybe being less precious about when you write. It seems like writing versus other art forms, like when I think of, say, someone who becomes a pianist, they're going to play Beethoven and Chopin and Mozart and as part of becoming who they are, whereas there's this mythos around the writer that they're alone and that all of their words are coming out of thin air, that it's pure genius and inspiration. But in a way, it feels like by engaging with these words, you're acknowledging sort of like not only your community, but like how you're able to stand where you are now as a writer because of the work that these other writers have done. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I think most people who write, they write because they love to read. They came to storytelling through reading or having people read to them, as I did. And so, I mean, that's definitely a big part of it. And recognizing, I think when one has written enough, you can look back and see when you think it's worked out, or you can see what it is that you were doing that you didn't realize back then. And I recognized when I was heading into spells that so much of what I've written is a reaction to something, whether it's an historical event or, it's a lot of times an historical event, but photographs in this case. But I'm so interested in reaction, which, putting myself in a situation or seeing what my curiosity draws me to, and then just seeing what comes out of me as material, as opposed to being in control of it. And so trusting oneself to wander, I guess, is part of the process.
And you say this interesting thing about the book that while on the one hand, there is a forward-moving narrative, a loosely forward-moving narrative with continuous characters that start with the book and end in the book, but that you also believe that people can enter the book anywhere they want at the same time. Yeah. So I was hoping you could talk about that the order and progression, while there is one, is of less importance to you, and how you envision a reader engaging with the book than would be typical if someone picked up another one of your novels, for instance.
Yeah, I think yes, it could be said that this is a book about three friends who are maybe 20 years old, who live in a city like Portland. But then it is a lot of other kinds of books too. And I think there are certainly pieces that are much less narratively driven and that are much more voice driven. There are folk tales. There's an essay written by a fourth grader about elephants. And so I think it's, anything, talking about curiosity, anything, whether it's the photograph or the text that draws a reader in, you can go in any direction. I was just talking yesterday in class about Alice Munro, and Alice Munro is, of course, a genius and such a great writer, and a writer that I don't know if I've learned more from anyone than from Alice Munro. I think our sensibilities are so different, which is maybe one reason I'm able to learn from her. I think writers that we feel some sort of similarity with, it's harder to see that. But in the preface to her selected story, she says that a story should be like a house, and you should be able to enter it anywhere. And she talks about reading stories never from beginning to end, that it should be solid enough that you can go in any direction. And And I feel that way. Often it's best for some reader to come through the window or go down the chimney. It could be for some reader, and this goes for, I guess I'll slow down and say, when you're writing something, there's a huge difference between the material and the story. And a lot of times figuring out what to do with the material is the storytelling, and a lot of times early on, we misapprehend our writing of material as the writing of the story. So when we're writing something, we don't go into every room that we know about. We don't enter at the beginning necessarily. But readers, I think, especially given how much time and how little attention span so many people have, they should be able to jump around. They should be able to come in. And the incremental way this book was written hopefully welcomes people to deal with it incrementally.
And the idea of the house is interesting because it troubles the idea of time in a story. Mm-hmm. If all of these rooms exist at the same time and you could start or finish in a different place. Mm-hmm. And she's such a master of really weird choices around time, I think. I mean, she seems unheralded as an experimental writer in some ways.
And I think in some ways it's so... it's similarly maybe to writers like Cheever. Like I love writers who just get weirder over the course of their life and kind of master a form and then start taking it apart. And I often teach Monroe when I talk about moving in time, because I think, of course, the reasons we move in time in a story or place are usually revolving around anxiety. Like we don't want to be there anymore. We don't know what to do, which is how we operate in our lives as well. But Alice Munro always stays in a scene as long as she wants. When she goes into a flashback, she stays there so long you forget it's a flashback, and it becomes so crucial that those writers, those characters in the past don't know they're in the past. They don't know that there's a future. And the main thing I think maybe that I learned from Alice Munro is how good she is at transitions. She sets up these different pieces of time, but her transitions are always like the next day or 2 hours later. And I think when we begin writing, we always want it to be more subtle than that. And I think she recognizes that that's not a dramatic point. Knowing where you are and when you are is something the reader just wants to know so they can deal with what's actually complicated.
Well, I want to return to something you briefly mentioned, the way in which a lot of your novels are connected and you don't see spells as part of that continuity. So Cari Luna, in her interview with you at Tin House, talks about this, the intersection and overlap and conversation between your books. For instance, she points out that there's a scene in The Bewildered that you retell from a different perspective in My Abandonment, and there's a thread from My Abandonment that becomes a narrative pivot point in The Shelter Cycle. And that you told her that you used different characters and events from previous books as touchstones or places to move forward from in your new project, which reminds me in a way of like when I was having a conversation with David Mitchell. He has the idea of the Uber novel for him, where like each novel of his is a chapter in his Uber novel. And there's these connections, some obvious and some really submerged between the books. So there's a spell cast between the books, and in a way, your book Spells is breaking that spell, or that you had this you made this attempt to break the spell between your books. Right. But nevertheless, you've also talked about how things that you discovered in your book right before, so The Shelter Cycle, informed some of your feelings when you were writing Spells. I mean, it'd be inevitable that you would have some life experiences that would. So, like, I'm curious about your reaction to writing about mysticism and about an unusual cult or religion in Montana, and how that might have carried over in some way to your orientation when you were writing Spells, even if a character isn't actually carrying over.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely one thing to say that in explicit ways there aren't connections between characters, but in following this idea of the Uber novel, I think, I don't know what I'm doing, but 20 years from now, I'll have enough perspective to say, oh, this is how this fit in with everything else I was doing. Because I think as much as we might try to think that what we're writing is not connected, we're not shedding our skin, and everything really does build, and it's one of the great pleasures of writing, on dissatisfaction with the thing before. How could I approach this differently, or how could it be different than what it is now? And I think sometimes just the wandering and the research and the interaction with people that goes into writing a book doesn't necessarily go into the project you're working on, but maybe into the future. And when I was working on the Shelter Cycle, it's very much congruent with or in league with my life, of course. Is sort of when I wrote my abandonment, I knew I was having a daughter, and I was very anxious about that. When I look at that book, which is the story of a father and a daughter living in the wilderness, I can see my anxiety about how to be a father. What kind of example are you? What advice do you give? And then by the time I wrote the Shelter Cycle, I had 2 daughters, and I recognized they were asking me questions that were so intense and that I didn't really have answers to big existential questions, that I'd been a very sort of cynical person growing up surrounded by Mormons, and most of my spiritual ideas were just negative ideas as opposed to things. And so I found myself in conversation with people in Montana who really believed in, energy as something that was changeable, that was driving everything, and people who had acted on it in the late 80s and gone underground. And it wasn't as if I necessarily believed all of their teachings, but it was a real buffeting. It was really a huge change for me to become a little bit more aware, to become a little bit more sensitive to some things, or to become willing to expose myself as foolish, or to recognize some of the things that were driving me. And so Spells is sort of, I think any conversation you have with someone, any story that you tell, is based on a series of compromises of what we've agreed is going to be real, how we've agreed time is going to operate, how language will operate. And I think I wanted to try to do away with some of those compromises or some of those agreements to see what would happen.
So tell me if this is one of them, because you've talked before about how it's often better if you're writing about someone who's on drugs or a dream sequence to dial down the language, to make it more concrete, maybe even flat, and that you were trying to do that with the Shelter Cycle, but that you sort of went the other way with Spells. Like you gave yourself permission to dial up the dreamlike quality and maybe even dial up the prose in the dreams in a way that is counter to what maybe was your aesthetic prior to that.
Right.
Do you feel like that is a product of maybe feeling less cynical about the metaphysical questions that arose out of interacting with this religious group?
I think definitely that's true. I think also it's just getting older in some ways, and I don't want to act as if I'm super old, but I think that in my 30s and 40s, maybe it's just like I think especially in our 20s and 30s, we do resist things that are nostalgic, things that are sentimental, and I sort of have come around in a way to want people to take the risk of seeming like they're too sentimental, to be uncomfortable in that way. And I think I do agree that if you're writing about something that is invisible, try to make it as concrete as possible. So the Shelter Cycle, the prose in that book is very concrete, and I tried to keep it as straight as I could. And so I was reacting a little bit to that. I think every writer has a tendency or a skill early on, and my skill was always voice or ventriloquism of some kind. And eventually I came to suspect that. And, I when I teach Hemingway, I talk about how a teacher gave me Hemingway in Our Time, his first book of stories, in college, and I thought it was so dumb. I thought it was ridiculous that someone would give me this book. And it was years later that I read those stories again and thought, this is exactly what I can't do. And so I spent a lot of time not trying to write like Hemingway, but trying to figure out how to write with dialogue and action and less voice. But yeah, I think there are 2 kind of strands to this answer too, like it's forking now, that when I wanted to write stories and when I realized I wanted to write something shorter, I recognized, first of all, that stories are the medium that I talk about when I teach. And I've kind of, it's funny to think about the story collection, The Unsettling, which seems so long ago to me, because back then I did write stories that were kind of a conventional length, and there were short stories as we understand them. But without consciously deciding it, I just stopped writing stories like that because I didn't have the time really, because when I was writing something longer, but also mostly because I was talking about stories all the time, and I'm so conscious of technical decisions, and I just wanted to get that kind of thinking away from me when I was actually writing. But part of it too is voice. Like I wanted to push things a little bit. I wanted to push the language enough where it got a little bit uncomfortable, where it seemed like it was kind of the point where you were reminded that it was writing in some way. And that is not the way I'd been thinking for a long time. And I guess whether it is questions of tone or voice, or if it's questions of even kinds of narrators, I tend to, or writing autobiographically, I tend to find that if I say sometime that I will never do something, that I'm probably about to do it.
Given that you're talking about a forked answer, let's have you read A Snake's Tongue is Forked.
Okay. So it's funny, when I was talking about collaboration with To Begin Is to Start, it's always also a collaboration with other things that you've written. So there are a lot of photographs of snakes that I got from the photographers, and I don't know if there's one photograph of a snake in the whole book, but the book has a lot of snakes in it, and snakes gain their own momentum. So you see in To Begin Is to Start recognizing the zipper's teeth as a snake's teeth and riffing on that. But To Begin Is to Start came quite a bit after A Snake's Tongue is Forked. And A Snake's Tongue is Forked is, I think, the first thing that I wrote in the book. And it's generated from a photograph by Shana Millette, which is a photograph, it's one of my favorites, of a piece of wallpaper that is cracked. A snake's tongue is forked. Everyone's heard of a hoop snake. It takes its tail in its mouth and rolls like a hoop, like a wheel, chasing a person or child or animal. It has a stinger on its tail, and if the snake rolls into a tree, if the stinger gets stuck in a tree, that tree will die. She might have seen one, a hoop snake might say she has. Tonight she's in the bedroom where no one sleeps anymore, where the furniture is gone and the window is dirty and the flowered wallpaper is cracked. What brought her here into this room where her grandmother died, here in the night with her face pressed against the wall? She followed a crack in the basement cement floor where it bent and forked along the wall next to the stairs, across the door frame, across the kitchen tiles. It is a line, a map, a piece of string to follow, wound tight around the house, squeezing all the time and the people in the rooms in those times, all the conversations and misunderstandings. A crack is a snake. A snake is a line, a forking line. Is a snake's tongue forked? A snake's tongue is forked. The roses in the wallpaper, the carnations, the vines cut in two by the crack, so they should fall, but they do not fall. She leans close, her nose almost touching, her eyelashes brushing the wall. Pay attention. There are other layers, old paper, the choices of other people, the smell of old paste that would go to powder if she took hold of the crack and tore it open, spilling the snake all lengthwise. If you sneak up behind a rattlesnake and take it by the tail, crack it like a whip, you can snap the head clean off its body. What if the head flipped back and bit you, in the hand or neck or face, if there was still venom in its fangs? There's a difference between poisonous and venomous. You should know it, should learn it. Heads without bodies are more dangerous somehow, more desperate and unpredictable, not moving in any way that is a pleasure to see, never saying anything you want to hear. She is intent, not losing her way, following each fork, doubling back. In the window behind her, a black dog could be running up the street, a full moon hanging. A head, a human head could float past, faintly smiling behind the glass. A snake cannot move on a sheet of glass. A snake on ice is useless. Snakes are shy creatures, and we are only beginning to find out more about how they live. A bird or a mammal, these are animals that can learn from experience. Snakes are deaf and have no eyelids and cannot learn like this. Once she saw a snake's head loose in the garden, its long body divided into 5 pieces by the blade of a mower. Joint snakes, if you hit one, it breaks up into pieces as long as your finger. A bull snake blows like a bull when it gets riled. A coach whip snake has a braided tail. It'll wrap around a person or animal and whip with its plaited tail until that person or child or animal has run themselves to death. She moves slowly, carefully. She is halfway through the house. She wonders if the crack is circular, if it will connect to itself like a hoop snake, or if it will never end. A snake will not stop growing because its enclosure is small. That is a myth. She believes all sorts of things. She is willing. She will follow anything that pulls her attention. This wallpaper is flocked, its vertical strips. The white flowers pressing up through the gray, the foliage, leaves holding the cool shadows below, the space where a snake can sleep or hide or be discovered, where it might slip into the open, peek its head out from under, its red tongue keeping time. Remember the joint snake all broken up, left behind in the yard? If you don't bury the head, if you leave it out with the rest, it will search for the other pieces, sniffing here and there with its tongue jerking in and out. By morning, that snake will be whole again.
We've been listening to Peter Rock read from his latest book, Spells. You were asked in one interview, Peter, if you considered yourself a magical realist, and you said no, that you loved the work of Julio Cortázar and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, but that you found that Marquez, that what he gained in wonder, it did so at the expense of tension. And you then talked about an essay by Cortázar called On the Environs of the Short Story, where he warns against what he calls the full-time fantastic. He says, the extraordinary must become the rule without displacing the ordinary structures in which it is inserted. And you riff off of this by saying that the power of experience and description that diverges from what we consider normal reality is contingent upon these flights and windows being connected to the world we agree upon. That the fact that everything isn't possible is actually an asset to the fantastical in the story. I was curious about these thoughts in relationship to Spells, because we have this tension in the book, obviously, around narrative and progression.
Right.
And this more dreamlike quality where you could enter the book and put it down as you would like. Right. So how do you deal with this question of, say, Marquez, where for you at least, you feel like there's a lot of wonder and no tension? How do you preserve the what happens next in Spells? Or do you? Or do you abandon it?
I think, there are different ways to think about tension, and I would hate to get a lot of hate mail about Marquez, whom I love also, but I think there are pieces of the novels especially, where you could take a lot of pages out and you'd miss a lot of beautiful writing, but you wouldn't necessarily miss what was going on. I just reread Chronicle of a Death Foretold the other day, and you couldn't take anything out of that book. And if you want to talk about moving around in time, that's really astounding. I guess I would say that it really is about communication, like making a decision to try to communicate something that is personal to someone who isn't you, and that's really hard. And to do that, you have to figure out how to get them interested. And so tension is such a crucial thing about writing, and it's so poorly understood, and it's so specific to everything that you write. But part of it is just writing the beginning of something that is going to get a reader wondering what's going to happen or wanting to read on. So there's a tension of what happens next, cause and effect, and that happens in this book. But there's also a tension about what comes next, which is sort of like what kind of story will come next, which hopefully is, as the world becomes wider and broader and more amorphous, and there still are causes and effects, part of the tension is between the kinds of stories, and part of the tension is hopefully in the language between the stories. So there's an energy in the language that creates a tension that is an electricity that carries you on. But I think a lot of times in storytelling, the tension is, a tension is always between two things or between more than two things. And the tension can be between the text and the reader, but a lot of times, of course, the tension is between the characters. And so trying to figure out what the relationship is between people and how that will change and how you can build up a kind of expectation in the characters for how the other person will be, but also in the reader for what would become of these relationships. So those are all things that I was sort of aware of especially in editing, when I'm teaching and also when I'm writing, I always think that the advantage of having written a lot is having made a lot of mistakes and having seen, those mistakes and trying to own them. But being super smart about writing stories is not going to help you write better stories. It's going to help you edit them. It's going to help you in revision. So all of these questions of like, where is tension coming from? Like, I think when I'm writing something, I feel energized. I feel energetic. And that hopefully is conveyed. But a lot of wondering about how that tension might be shared or how someone might be intrigued or how curiosity might be piqued. A lot of that technical work is in revision, and that is where, if you have worked on becoming smarter about writing, you can bring that to bear.
Well, I like how you frame a different form of possible what happens next, in the sense that I do feel like as a reader of spells, I'm less... I'm interested in what's going to happen to the characters. It's not that I'm not interested, but I'm more interested to see what are you going to dream up next on page X. That's going to also carry those characters forward, but in a really strange way. Yeah. On that level, let's have you read another really short piece, just for variety's sake, so we can hear like how these different sections sound really different from each other. So, if a person is about to touch you, would be, I think, a good example. Okay.
I believe this is also, I sometimes forget, I think it's a photograph by Shana Millette, and it's a photograph of a hand. It's a little, the background's a little blurry. The hand is just kind of floating. If a person is about to touch you. If a person is about to touch you, you can already feel it. If you are about to meet someone, your body may already know it, a tremor in your organs. If a hand hovers above your bare skin, you can sense its presence. That's the simple, invisible way a hand can convey its intentions, which are, after all, a kind of thinking. Hands have brains and hearts, every finger does. This can be proved by the delay, the time it takes to understand what our hands have done and why. Hands. They are the vehicles of intuition. When I am beset by emotion, when I think of something, that's when I ask my hands for assistance. And then, when my hands suddenly do something, that is the time for me to react. They're out in front of me. They're almost always in front of me, in my field of vision, the part of myself that I know best. When I see my face in a mirror, I am often startled or disappointed. My hands would never surprise me like that. I recognize them, reaching out for you.
We're listening to Peter Rock read from Spells. There's another interview you did that I really enjoyed in After Image magazine. That makes the case that you have a long-standing impulse toward ekphrastic writing. Ekphrasis being engaging with and bringing to life visual art using words. So Longmire, the author, makes a connection between your use of photographs and spells and your use of news items and my abandonment and actual historical events in the shelter cycle. I'm not entirely convinced that this is a strong argument that they're all ekphrastic, but it does seem like they share an outward look for inspiration, that you're looking away from yourself as a form to, as a way to begin or as a way to inspire the projects. And I was wondering if that seems, do you rebel against that thought, or does that seem...
Yeah, I mean, it's always funny because I'm not aware of things when I'm doing them, and it's sort of, I of course love talking to you, and then I also have this sense of what I have to say about things that I did in the past is pretty suspicious. I can see that a little bit, and as I said before, I can recognize that I'm reacting to things, which is the key, and that everyone writes about things that interest them. And so trying to figure out what interests you specifically as opposed to everyone, I think, is important. And then trying to figure out what that is going to generate is a question. And so I think that, looking forward to the things that I'm working on now or things that are, maybe in the future, I think it is sort of possible to see this as a reaction, but it causes us to have to define what is an artwork and what is a piece of history and how are these things different, which I'm not sure I'm ready to go into necessarily. But I think that we all, I mean, as someone who doesn't write much nonfiction, but who teaches a lot of it and reads a lot of creative nonfiction, I feel like there's always so much self-presentation, whether it's implicit or explicit in nonfiction. I feel like fiction, most of the time, we're pretty unconscious of how we're revealing ourselves. So I feel like it's a much more cloudy mirror, but I think it's a truer reflection of what is going on with us. So, but I think a lot of it, like I've been thinking a lot about Charles Birchfield lately, and I've been writing about his painting. And he was a painter who died in '67 when I was born, and and he's sort of like a American fauvist or something, and he lived in the Midwest and wrote and painted these very spiritual landscapes in watercolor, especially when he was in his early 20s, I guess. And then he became kind of a realist for a long time in his life. And the last 20 years of his life, he went back to those early paintings and felt like he lost something and tried to work on them some more, add to them or add new sheets of paper. But reading his writing to his journals has been so informative for me. And I think that, I guess, I see the ways that I get so excited when I'm writing something, and the ways that I find the making of things to be such a sweet possession is easier for me to recognize in other art forms than it is in writing. Like, I'm not that interested in hearing writers talk about writing, generally speaking, but to hear a painter talk about, like, to read the interviews of Francis Bacon or something, or to read the amazing journals of Birchfield, who's just a great example for me in many ways, both as a really devoted family man and as someone who is just so true to spiritual quest that was so divorced from so much of what was going on in the world at that time. I think that I find really interesting.
Well, let me push deeper into this question a little bit. You've talked before about how your career is littered with lost books, books where you've completed drafts that haven't been published. So in between some of your published books, there are these lost books, and that these books tend to be more autobiographical, and that they tend to be closer to your point of view as who you are in the world as a non-writer,
right.
Age, gender. Do you have any thoughts on why you think that is? Why are the books that don't end up cohering, or that you don't feel like are ready for or function outside of your relationship to them, tend to be more that way?
I think, I mean, that sounds so great. And I know I said it, but I think maybe it's a simplification. But I think that is true. I think I've failed. And I have this new book coming out, which is maybe the first time that something is going to come out that's like this. But I recognize what the problem is, or one of the problems, which is that when I write autobiographically, I already believe all of the things, and so the writing isn't the same process. When I'm writing from the perspective of an old man, or I'm writing from the perspective of a young girl, like thinking about my abandonment, I have to convince myself of that person. I have to convince myself of that voice. I do a lot of work to get there. And that, I think, is what translates to the readers, that belief. I think it's harder for me to make a reader believe in my own life, because I don't have to do that work, and that work is the writing. And so I think that is a little bit true. I think it's true, too, that there are a lot. I mean, I was listening to that excellent introduction that you gave when we started to talk, and I thought, that sounds so great. Like, who is this guy? It's so impressive. When actually it's just so humiliating a lot of the time. And, even selling a book now is sort of like I sell books for the same amount of money that I sold books in 1997, and it's hard to find someone who will do it based on how the last book did or whatever. But I'm not that, fortunately, I don't need that. I'm not that interested in it all the time. And I'm not convinced that some of the books are not, that haven't come out aren't as good or better. I was writing as an experiment 3 different books at a time. And one was my abandonment, and one was a book about, there's a character in that book named Nameless, who's a person who's trying to sort of cast off being a human being. And I wrote a whole novel about that character, Nameless. And whenever I talk about it, people say, well, and even I think my agent, because I gave him both of these books, just like, well, what about that book? What is going on? I felt like it didn't have its own obsession in some ways. It was reaching for the other books to make connections, but I also I lost the thread in a way. Like I'm not going to go back and work on something now when there are new things that are calling to me. But I think a lot of it does have to do with, we really get at something, or we really express who we are as a person when we're paying attention to something else. When we're paying attention to ourselves, there's just so much clutter. There's so much self-consciousness that is problematic for me.
And you talked at the beginning of the episode about this coming out of procrastination, and that you've also talked to your students about how to harness the energy of procrastination. Is that somehow connected? This idea of looking elsewhere and then taking the energy of that impulse to do it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's sort of... I think it's easy to believe, especially when one is a student, that there are times when you're writing and that there are times when you're not writing. And I think trying to see, one's life as a kind of practice, where one is always writing in some way. And sometimes that involves putting a pen to paper, and sometimes it doesn't. But one big step for me is just not worrying that much about it when I'm not writing. But to recognize that there are a lot of things going on that eventually I will be able to use. But being aware, but also actively seeking out information, actively seeking out things that you don't know about, and trying to gather material without knowing what you're going to do with it has been always the most helpful thing for me.
Well, if we were to look at where you gravitate towards as a writer in terms of point of view, it seems like it's very often childhood or adolescence, and more often than not a female point of view.
Right.
Do you have any stories you tell yourself on why you think that is? Are there specific advantages, either in terms of activating your imagination or the maybe the distance between what the adult reader feels versus the child protagonist that you find compelling when you're putting together a narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it does fall into sort of stories I tell myself in retrospective why this is so. I think that part of it is just immaturity. Like, I think I did write a bunch of books without, like, looking back to the Ambidextrous and the Bewildered, where a lot of the characters were teenagers. And I didn't know why. I wasn't sure why that was the case, and I think it was that's such a rich time. It's like a lot of adult experiences happen to us for the first time then, and they're not clouded by repetition in any way. And it's the first time when we have freedom from being watched all the time, and we don't have responsibilities like jobs either. So it's a very rich window of sort of things happening and figuring out who we're going to be. And one time, I think even on the radio, I was talking about this, and someone called in who was a child psychologist and said, that period of time between 11 and 14 is when our sense of self develops, and when we get a feeling for who we are with regard to the world, like how we fit in, how we understand things. And no matter what we do for the rest of our life, you could kind of track it back to that time. Like our understanding doesn't change that much. So that's part of it. Part of it too, writing from female perspective, when I was thinking about my abandonment, that was, inspired by a real story. And I was thinking about the reasons why people were interested in it. The reasons I was interested in it had a lot to do with this sense of wonder. And if I had chosen a different perspective, it would have been a story that was much more about homelessness and maybe PTSD in a more explicit way. But I wanted to be a little bit delusional in its wonder. And I realized that it had to come from this perspective. And that was around the time I referenced this earlier, when I was thinking, like, I just feel like young narrators are so manipulative and so precious. And so trying to figure out how to do that on my own terms was part of it. But I recognized that if I wanted to write that book to be true to the things that fascinated me about the true story, it had to be her story. I think it's probably true that I prefer women to men, which is, there are probably upsides and downsides to that. But I think it's a very explicit way that signals to me as when I'm writing something that's not me. But if you look at that book, and if I look at it now, I see, oh, this is a character who is being told a lot of things about the world by her father that she doesn't quite understand, a lot of directions from an authority figure that are hard to bring into alignment, a person who's lonely, who really wants friends. Like, these are all things that personally I know. Like, this is me. And so it's not as if I'm ever escaping myself. I don't think that happens when you're writing. But it's a way to get at those things without being hyper aware of what I'm writing about.
Well, I'm going to try to maybe make a forced connection, but
Okay.
But you were talking about wonder, and at the beginning how when the first photographer you talked to writes you this letter full of all of these questions, deep, maybe unanswerable questions, which in some respects prompted you to want to write a book that was more playful and full of wonder. You've also talked about writing in order to think backwards to get to a place where you can entertain questions that adults no longer entertain. And you mentioned Baudelaire's journals, where he asks questions which kind of, I mean, they're not the same, but they kind of remind me of this photographer's questions. Where do our dead friends go? Or what a loss it is that we are unable to communicate with our friends, the animals. And these questions he's not asking with any irony. He's asking them earnestly, almost childlike.
Right.
And so I'm curious if that might be part of the gravitation towards that point of view also as a writer.
Yeah. I mean, certainly there's nothing in any moment in my day that isn't informed by the fact that I have children. And so my conversations with them, which is something I've been writing about too, is sort of, when I was working on the shelter cycle, the Church Universal and Triumphant, which was the church, one of their big beliefs was that they had a lot of beliefs around children, and you should pay careful attention to the things that they said, because they were still kind of in touch with the spheres, and they hadn't been corrected yet, and they hadn't been told what to believe. Like, if they were talking about things, they were talking about things that were in the ether or things from their previous lives, and we should write everything down and pay attention to that. So there is something about that, that sense of wonder that you want to maintain, but I think there's also a way getting to be 50 where you feel like, okay, like half of my time is gone. Like, what, how can I stop being so cynical about things? How can I admit the things I don't know? How can I, without being insufferably twee, try to engage with this confusion that I feel?
And in that regard, one of the constraints that you had at the beginning also was you wanted to preserve a certain naivete or a lack of knowledge around both the photographers and what the photographers were portraying with the photographs. And I'm curious if you learned anything since then, since the book has come out, that has stuck with you.
Yeah,
I mean, that might not have formed the narrative, but like, wow, that photograph was this, or this photographer, I had no clue that that's what this photographer was all about, even because you were creating an intentional not knowing.
Right. And it's sort of, I mean, we collaborate, I think, in order to do things that we wouldn't do on our own. And I've, started other projects and thought about them based on my reactions to this one. And this collaboration is very controlled by me. Like, I'm collaborating with people's photographs, but they didn't get to collaborate in terms of reacting to my writing. So as you said, when I first communicated with the photographers, I said, I don't want to know anything about you. I don't want to know any context for these photographs. Just don't tell me anything. And that worked out pretty well. But then it was interesting because once I finished writing and I was in communication with them all the time, I would pick up things, and then sometimes people would come to town. And so Colleen Plum came to town to have a show at Blue Sky, and I got to know her fairly well. And I've met 4 of the 5 photographers now, which is eerie. I mean, I guess I collaborate sometimes with people when I write books, and my relationship with them is so intense, and their relationship to me is not that intense. So when I meet them, I feel like we've been in this communion for years, and they just think I'm super creepy. But with the photographs, and it is sort of interesting, like that picture of the wallpaper, when I talked to Shayna about it and she read the piece, oftentimes people will say, this is not what is going on in this photograph, but the emotions that you're conjuring are very much in accordance with where this is coming from. They'll tell me the story of burying the dog, and who the dog was and what happened. And they have found, I think, often illumination and intrigue in how their photographs have managed to sort of project what was going on at that moment in a kind of oblique way. So I kind of considered, and I asked so much of them already, but I almost wanted them all to write something in that, maybe in the acknowledgments about specific photographs, like where it is actually, what is happening, how this differs from the story, like what they think about it.
Yeah.
And in different times, I think they have in different places. But I sort of wish that could have been something that had been part of it. Like, I feel like it's very much my project and that they are so crucial to helping me, but their words, and I mean, in some ways their words are not here, and they're people who speak through images. So even sometimes I would write something and I give it to them, and I would expect them to read it right away and have a lot of opinions, but they're not people necessarily who read a lot. Like, that's my game. That's not their game. They took the photos. And so that was good for me to recognize also.
Well, it was satisfying for me to read. There's an interview with Colleen Plum, one of your photographers, and she says the experience of providing you the photos, but then abandoning control and then seeing what you picked and how you used them, that has since influenced her to take more seriously certain photos that she hadn't considered seriously, simply because they were family photos or images that had been more metaphoric or emotional, with emotional intentions behind them.
Right.
And now in her own work, she's finding that she can see things in the photographs, the value of a photograph that is more metaphoric or has more emotions. That's pretty cool that it's created this outside of the book, obviously.
Yeah. But, I mean, I would love to take credit for that. I mean, she's an amazingly talented, smart person. And so is really fortunate. Yeah.
And she also said this experience around, you have these audio-visual videos where the photos have been like semi-animated, essentially.
Right.
And her experience of reading it, of watching one of her photos made into these videos, reminded me a little bit of that John Berger series from the 70s, Ways of Seeing, where he shows a painting and then puts different music, and the painting looks entirely different.
Yeah.
And she's like seeing her photo, and it's as if she's never seen her photo before.
Right.
It's pretty amazing.
Right. And those videos, I mean, that's another level of collaboration where when it became a gallery show, is a question of how to show this, because people don't want to stand in front of an image for 3 minutes, even if they can stream the audio, which they could, and could videos be made? And then this challenge of how do you make something that's static, visually interesting? And Matt Eller, who's a man who lives in town, he has a company called Afternoon Inc., took this on, and he's also a genius, as is John Askew, who did the music. And so these guys were working on making those videos, and it was so, one of the strangest things to me and one of the most humbling things to me was throughout the process how great the photographers were, as I said before, about how excited they were to let me do whatever I wanted. But then in retrospect, I understood that a little bit better, because what I was doing was paying really close attention to something they made for hours and days and weeks and months. And when John and Matt were working on the videos, they would CC me on various emails they were sending back and forth at 3 a.m. about things. And I would think, these guys are so crazy. But I was so, and they would be worried that I would be uptight about something. And I was just so touched and excited that they were spending their time and their talents to try to make this work out in some way. And so, and those are all, visible on my website and stuff. I think that they are really mesmeric and strange. And there's something in seeing that for me too, which is giving up control, which is something that on a basic level is what the hope is when we're writing something. And which is something I'm trying to teach the students all the time, that, you're not going to be able to hopefully travel around and be everywhere someone reads your work. You're not going to be able to explain it to them. They're going to have their own take on it. And one dream for many of us is to have people who aren't our friends and family read things that we write, and they're going to have a lot of freedom. So it's really nice to see people take seriously what I was doing and to do their own thing with it. It was great.
So what can we expect from you next, Peter Rock?
Oh, some of it is so top secret I can't think about it.
Can you talk about the My Abandonment film project?
Yeah, I mean, that's another kind of collaboration. So My Abandonment, even before it came out as a book, these producers bought it and optioned it. And it's happened to me before with other books, but there's always been a part of that deal where it was, and you get to write the screenplay, and if it gets into production, then you'll get paid for that. And I learned a lot about different media. I learned a lot about dialogue doing that, but it never really worked out. This one, it seemed more likely to me because they didn't want me to do the screenplay, but I got lucky in that the woman who adapted it, Deborah Granick, is a really great director and a really interesting, genius filmmaker, thinker. And she had made a film that I liked quite a bit, Winter's Bone, was her last film. And she had adapted that from a Daniel Woodrow book, which I liked also. So I felt like I was in good hands. And we talked a lot about the adaptation and the changes she made, but it's very much different than the book and her thing. And I kind of liked it that way. And they shot it last summer. And I think it's, hopefully we'll be at Sundance in January, February. So it's pretty soon here I'll see the first cuts of it. But it'll be beautiful. I don't know if it'll be a great film. Hopefully it will be. But the things I've seen, we're fortunate that we live in a beautiful place, and they found amazing places to shoot. And I think the performances are great. And it was just, for me, another kind of dissociation to see something that is very much internalized in my mind, taken in a different direction, or like have actual people who don't look exactly like the people I had in mind, in places that are different than what I thought they would look like, saying things that I wrote, sometimes saying things that I didn't write, or seeing a director play one scene 20 different times really reminds me of writing a paragraph and taking it apart and putting it together. But then it's just the catering, or all the dudes with duct tape running around. It's just like, I feel like I did this 12 years ago. I was in my basement and somehow this has happened. So I'm really curious to see what it looks like. But it is never my dream really to have a film made of my book. So it's also just kind of a little bit silly. But you're kind
of in the role of the photographers are in, with you,
right.
But with the film.
Right. I guess I don't feel like it's silly. I feel like it's silly because I get congratulated for it often, and I feel like I didn't really do anything except long ago I did a thing. And so it's wonderful to see that someone throwing their energy into it and making something that I couldn't do.
Yeah.
So that is very cool. And to talk more about myself, I do have this book coming out, which is called The Weather, which will come out in 2019. And that's a book which draws on a lot of artifacts of my life in 1994, which was a particularly bleak time. And kind of tries to figure out what was going on at that time, but it also involves a lot of things that are going on in my life now. So a lot of conversations with my daughters, a lot of writing about Charles Birchfield, who I've talked about, a lot of interactions with former girlfriends, trying to figure out whether or not we ever broke up. Letters, the letters that I wrote, really uncomfortable things. And so that I'm still working on, but it will come out, and I'm curious to see how that will go.
Yeah. Well, it's great having you on the show today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.
We're talking today to writer Peter Rock about his latest book, Spells, a novel and photographs from Counterpoint. You've been listening to Between the Covers. I'm David Naiman, your host. Today's program was recorded at the studios of KBOO, volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength community radio from Portland, Oregon, found at kboo.fm. If you enjoyed today's program, consider supporting the show by going to patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And also while you're there, check out the growing archive of bonus material available. Thanks for listening.